Hi, this is Heather Smith. I'm an occupational therapist with CMS, and I'm going to be continuing the discussion on unique mealtime needs. First, we're going to talk about safe feeding and eating strategy recommendations to help prevent aspiration. You learned about aspirations in the previous recording, and so the number one thing that you want to be aware of is when you are helping a student feed is their positioning. So you want to think about having the students positioned at 90 degrees, so sitting upright. So think about, if you have a student in a wheelchair who is reclined, that is probably a very difficult position for them to be in to participate in feeding activities. So for example, if you were in a recliner and lean back, we would automatically do some things ourselves that would make it easier for us to swallow. We might sit up some, we might tilt our head forward. Our students don't have that same ability. So you want to make sure that they are as upright as possible to complete that swallowing. So, at home, sometimes if you're leaning back, try to see what it feels like to swallow when you're leaning far back and how difficult that is. So, when you think if it's difficult for yourself, it's definitely going to be difficult for a student who doesn't have the same muscle strength in their throat that we do. Next, you want to think about feeding slowly. I know that we are all on a time crunch for lunch, but this is really about the safety of the student, and so we have to make sure that that we're going at a speed that is appropriate for the student. So sometimes that means that it might take a little bit longer. And also when you're doing the when you're feeding slowly, you want to make sure that each bite is fully being swallowed until before you begin the next bite. Number three, you want to encourage small bites and sip sizes. So thinking about make sure that you are giving the students the amount that is appropriate for them. Again, even with lack of time, we don't want to be putting too much on the spoon, and really making sure that we're doing appropriate sizes. Next, we want to make sure that we're doing that single swallow, so that each time before you put food back in a student's mouth, you want to make sure that all the food that you just put in has been swallowed. So you will often look for food in the side of students' cheeks. Students can do what's called pocketing their food, where they put it in different locations within their mouth. So you just want to make sure that you have fully checked and are not loading up the student's mouth with food, which would then make it even more difficult to swallow. For number five, just like what you do at home when you're feeding yourself, you're going to do solids, then a liquid. You're going to eat and then drink, and eat and then drink to help make sure that everything's going down smoothly. It's the same thing with our students, and also it increases the pleasure for students to be able to not just have one thing at a time. Number six, no talking while eating. So, try for the students to encourage them to focus on the feeding as much as they can. And then last, to remain upright for 20 to 30 minutes following the feeding. This is, again, particularly about our students in wheelchairs, not to recline them immediately after, and also not to have students lay down who may have some trouble with self-feeding. Next, we're going to continue to talk about proper positioning. Like we just spoke about a second ago, sitting in midline in a stable position with your head upright. Just like we said, when you tilt your head up, it's a lot harder to do. And so what that does basically is, when you're thinking about CPR, the first thing they always tell you to do is open the airway by lifting that chin up. Well, if you open the airway for a student when they're eating, or their head's all the way back when you give them food, you're basically opening their airway, which can then lead to aspiration and that food going into their lungs rather than into their stomach. So Always kind of keep that in mind that, a chin down is going to be, and midline is going to be a lot safer than looking up when the student's eating. So that's both reclining and head positioning. Again, with the feeding, if the student's in their in a wheelchair, you want to make sure their hips are as far back as possible. They're sitting as upright as possible to keep that head in alignment. And if you have to stabilize the student's head just briefly for the food to get in, but then remove your hand while the student manages the food. So, sometimes we'll have students who are moving quite frequently that makes it very difficult to have to get the spoon or fork into their mouths. So just a brief stabilization. If the student is looking up like we talked about before, which may make it difficult, you can just make sure they're swallowing where their head's in a good position, but you definitely don't want to be holding a student's head throughout an entire feeding session, so that they have breaks. So we have videos to show some examples of this. So this is a video of assisting in stabilizing a student's head. So we slowed the head movement. The student was able to grasp the cup. And then as the student brings it to the mouth, the OT let go of the student's head to return to feeding. Next, it's really important that we follow all diet orders. So this includes field trips. It includes if a parent brings in cupcakes for a birthday party, that we always have to be aware of what their feeding order is. So, for example, if a student is on a puree diet, but their parents have brought in cupcakes, if you feed the student something that is above what their diet order says and they have an issue, then that is on us for not following the diet order. So you always have to make sure that you're following what that diet order is. And also that's just the safest way to do everything, that we're following what the doctors have seen through swallowing tests that the student's able to handle. That being said, if you have a regular diet for a student and you think they need their food cut up into smaller pieces, you can make things easier that way, but you can't move up. So you could not, if they have a diet order for chopped food, give them the solid food. But you could, if you needed to, adapt for just those small little things like that. Always make sure the student is awake and alert when they're being fed. You want to use simple verbal cues. It's very, very important to let the student know what they're eating, what you're feeding them, give them choices to smell the foods that are coming up. If they are unable to see the food or make the choices themselves, to give food that is in a way that is the most appealing. If you have a puree diet and you're mixing everything together, it might not taste so good and it might make it harder for the student to eat. So really just think about what would be most comfortable for you if you were eating as well. So if it's something that you personally wouldn't want to do, then it's probably something our student doesn't necessarily want to do either. Just remembering that. You always want to use a calm and quiet voice when you're feeding a student. If you were to yell out at someone across the cafeteria when they're feeding and startle a student, that can cause a swallowing reaction, which again could lead to aspiration. So you just want to have a calm and quiet voice when you're helping students eat, and again that leads to helping the students be calm when they're feeding. Next, if a student is talking, laughing, crying, making vocalizations, that's not when to put the food in the mouth. So you really want to make sure that the student is calm and and ready to eat when it's time to feed. Next, we're going to continue to talk about safe feeding techniques to support students and staff. So tips for assisting students. Never, ever, ever place your fingers inside a student's mouth. A lot of our students have what's called a tonic bite, which is when they bite down and it's really difficult to release that bite. So if you stick your finger in there and a student has a tonic bite, it's going to be very, very uncomfortable for you. I always suggest to use a spoon or fork with everything that you're helping a student eat if they're not doing finger feeding themselves. So if you're an adult feeding a student, I always, always, always suggest use a utensil to do that. Whenever you are feeding a student with the spoon or fork, do not use their teeth to remove the food from the spoon. You want to wait for them to have a lip closure, and then you can remove the spoon. So sometimes you can also kind of take the spoon up to the student's top lip to help encourage that lip closure, but never use the teeth to do that. Avoid using the spoon to clear food from the chin. You want to use a firm blotting to wipe the mouth rather than lightly wiping it, because if you're using the spoon to clear food from the chin, students are still trying to figure out where that spoon is and what's happening, and it can give them some inconsistent cues. So you want to just use that blotting and then not wiping and not clearing with the spoon. There's also great ways to get students engaged in their feeding. So to use an example is to use a Big Mac where you have it recorded that it says like, I want another bite, or I want a drink, or yes, no's to certain food choices. So if a student is eating and you want them to have their drink, you can cue by saying like, oh, what do you need? And then have them hit the Big Mac, because it's feeding can be a very, very motivating activity for a lot of students. So if we can have them motivated to use their communication strategies while eating and be able to make some of those choices in feeding is a great thing to do. Next, if a student has what's called a tongue protrusion or a tongue thrust, where they stick their tongue forward, the best thing to do to help with that is to put pressure on the tongue, which helps them bring their tongue back and into their mouth. And then you also just want to kind of do it in a slow manner. So here is an example of that. So see, the student has his tongue out. Therapist waits. The pressure there. And the student completes the bite. And now this time you can see after the first one, he was ready to go ahead and have that next bite without as much assistance from the therapist to cue him. And there he is ready again with even less tongue protrusion.
There you go. I'm going to try that.
Okay. Next, we're going to talk about that tonic bite that we were discussing earlier. So tips for assisting students with a tonic bite is to use one of these, the spoons that are shown here, which is called a maroon spoon, or to use a coated metal spoon. So it's a metal spoon that has a plastic on it. Typically, these are going to be provided by your OT. And if an OT provides you with a certain type of spoon, please use the spoon that they are providing. There's a reason that this utensil has been selected for a student. Feel free to discuss and ask, for examples for why certain things are being used, but there's different sizes for the base of the spoon based on what the student is able to tolerate safety-wise. that you want to make sure that you're always following through with whatever suggestion that OT has given you. Again, the tonic bite is that uncontrolled bite due to increased muscle tone. So these marine spoons that are pictured here, the coated spoons, they're all made out of a special plastic that doesn't break. So it's really, really important to use those. This is also true for if you're going on a field trip, to take your spoons with you instead of, you never want to use a plastic spoon that's, out of container, because if a student bites that and could easily break that, and it's a very strong safety issue. If a student does bite down on a spoon, you don't want to pull the spoon out. You never try to pull it. So what you want to do is, if you can, you wait for their jaw to relax before moving the spoon. You can also kind of put a firm pressure downwards on the spoon to help them relax their bite. And once they've relaxed their bite, then remove the spoon. But never pull for if they're biting for their teeth, or just wait for them to relax and then remove their spoon. For our students who have kind of busy hands when we're eating, you want to help to get them where they're holding their utensil in one hand, but the other hand may need to be stabilized. And then you want to fade away once the student grabs utensils. This is just like we talked about earlier with head control, that you can help to stabilize that hand, but you don't want to be holding the student's hand down throughout an entire meal. But to help them be successful, you can stabilize for just a little bit. Again, here's an example. The therapist helps get the spoon fork in their hand, helps stabilize the student's hand, and then they're right up to the fork. And that's it. Okay. Next, for students with visual impairments, we really want students to have a consistent idea of where their food is on the plate. So first, always use those verbal cues to tell the student where you're going to put their food and what food they have on their plate, and also what food you're giving them at any time if they're dependent for self-feeding. If you have to feed them, tell them what every bite is. Give them as many choices about what bite they're going to get. Follow through that. If they're an independent eater, you want to use consistent placement of where you keep the utensils, where you keep the cup and the drink, and then even in this first compartment is going to be in this picture here. The first, you're going to place where the chicken nuggets closest to the student, the vegetables closest to the student, and then maybe different vegetables in the back. So each meal, the student knows that, like, my meat is in the front right, next side is a starch, and then a vegetables in the back. That each time you're trying to be as consistent as possible, that you're always placing the foods in the same location, so the student learns when they are feeding themselves where to kind of target their food options. For safety with feeding, the OT department has unique mealtime procedure cards. These are a really great way to give you a little snapshot of how the student is feeding. It's really, really beneficial for new students and substitutes as well. So it can be completed with the teacher, the OT, parents, school nurse, any information that is important to have on there. Please add it to these lists. A lot of times we will take these cards, laminate them, and then put them with the students' cafeteria codes, so that you have it with you going to the cafeteria every single day, so you know what their diet type is, what equipment they're using. If there's something special that they need and also what allergies they have. Anytime a diet order changes, this form needs to be updated as well. So, you know, keep these as updated as possible at all times. So we also have this link for the unique mealtime. This will be located on the OT website. So you always have to say make a copy, and then it will bring it up. And this is just an example of what they look like. So you can type in all your information here, who it was completed by, what clothing protection they use. And so we'll see an example of this right here. Next. Again, that will be on the OT department website. So unique mealtime procedure cards. So this is just an example of one of these. Let me close. Sorry. There you go. Tips for assisting students with the procedural label. So first and last name, whether they're working on a feeding goal on their IEP is great information to know what type of diet they have. So here it says regular. It could say puree, soft, cut into small pieces. It could have a lot of different information there. Equipment, so this is plastic coated fork. That would be a plastic coated spoon more than likely. A cup with a straw just tells you what equipment they are using. That their food must be cut into small bites for their special feeding instructions. This student is able to complete finger feeding. They can use a fork if the food is placed on the fork, and then they can bring it to their mouth to complete feeding. Keep the tray away from the student because she'll push it off the table. So just, this special kind of information. It could say things like student doesn't like strawberries. You could also have those types of things on there for a substitute who is going to be coming in and gathering their lunch trays. But if you had certain special feeding things like that, you could have it on there. Allergies, no peanuts or peanut butters for the student. And this student wears a large bandana or an oversized shirt to cover their clothing. So that's just an example of how you could use a feeding card. Here's the CMS diet order form. This is also on the CMS intranet and the student handbook. So a diet order form is completed for students with special nutritional needs, and it has a medical authorization. So this form has to be completed by a doctor, and then it is transferred on to the school nutrition services for their meal modifications. So it is embedded here into the, this is an example of what it looks like on the school nutrition's website. The diet order here is here at the bottom. So these always have to be up to date. Cafeteria managers tend to have a copy of what the diet order is at your school. Sometimes nursing can also have the diet order, but cafeteria managers almost always have a list of students and what their diet orders are if you're not sure about a student. I like at the beginning of the year to make sure that I know what all my students' diet orders are and periodically check back to make sure that nothing's changed in case that information hasn't trickled back down to you or to your OT, just to periodically check in and make sure there's been no changes in any diet orders. So on the CMS diet order form, it is going to say what the student diagnosis is and what makes it difficult for them to complete the feeding, swallowing, or what have you. This includes life-threatening food allergies would be on there. It's going to tell you what the food texture is for the diet order. Again, pureed, ground, chopped, and which foods should be avoided. Any student who has a life-threatening food allergy, they must have an emergency action plan in the school. So everyone will know what it's going to go from, what's going to happen if a student does have a food that is on their allergy list. That's also a great thing to have on those mealtime planning cards that we were talking about earlier. If you know what that action plan is, if you can write that on there, that would be great for all involved. So again, this is the update or the full diet order. So this is how we know if a student needs and a diet order, how it breaks down here. So if we are notified about it, or if there is a student receives emergency information from an adult saying, the parent or guardian saying that they have unique meal times. When that happens, we then make sure that they have a diet order form. And then when the diet order form comes back, we have to make sure that, well, when we give it to the parents, they take it to the doctor or the medical provider to fill out the full medical order form. And then it can be mailed or emailed to the nutritional services. And then the dietitian reviews that form. And then incomplete diet forms we're gonna go back to get additional information. When completed forms are done, then it gets sent to cafeteria manager, parent and guardian, and then the cafeteria manager shares this with the school nurse. And then we have the emergency action plan, and the teacher also knows the emergency action plan. This is kind of the process for how to get those diet orders. So that is everything. If you have any questions, you can email either myself or the OT department. We have some great information on our website. If you'd like to reach out to me personally, my email is heatherb.smith@cms.nc.us. So again, that's heatherb.smith. So thank you, and please reach out to your OT or anyone that, if you have any questions about feeding and want to make sure you're doing it as safe and productively as possible. Thank you so much.